on! I've got you! Almost there! Stay with me!
The diamond ring hit the white marble with a sound that shouldn't have been as loud as it was. But in the silence of 300 held breaths, it echoed like a gunshot. Seong-chul didn't even flinch. He just stared at Amaka, standing frozen at the altar in her massive wedding dress, the layers of silk and lace suddenly feeling like a burial shroud rather than a celebration. "I can't do this," he said into the microphone, his voice steady in a way that made everything worse. "I won't marry you, Amaka. I never should have asked." The church erupted in gasps. Somewhere behind her, a woman screamed. But Amaka couldn't move. She stood there, her carefully styled curls beginning to come loose, mascara already threatening to run, and watched as the man she'd loved for 3 years reached down to pick up the ring he'd just thrown at her feet. He didn't even look at her as he walked past. He walked straight toward the third row, where her rival sat in a dress that was far too white for a guest and far too triumphant for someone who'd just witnessed a wedding implode. The cameras came out. Of course they did. 300 phones rose into the air like an army of judging eyes, all pointed at her, all recording the exact moment Amaka's life shattered into a million unfixable pieces. Someone was crying. It took Amaka a moment to realize it was her. Her hands shook as she fumbled for her phone tucked into the hidden pocket of her dress. She needed her brother. She needed Chidi to come get her, to take her out of here before she collapsed in front of everyone, before the humiliation became a permanent scar she'd never escape. Through blurred vision, she found his contact. Her fingers moved on their own, typing out a message she could barely see through her tears. "He left me. I'm at the altar. Please, just come and take me away." She hit send. The doors at the back of the church burst open exactly 3 minutes later. Not opened. Not pushed. Kicked. The sound of splintering wood cut through the chaos of whispers and camera clicks, and every head in the sanctuary turned at once. Men in charcoal suits flooded in, moving with the kind of precision that suggested they'd done this before. They fanned out along the walls, their faces expressionless, their hands clasped in front of them in a way that could have been respectful if it weren't for the undercurrent of threat that radiated from every single one of them. And then he walked in. Korean. Broad-shouldered in a way that made his perfectly tailored black suit look like it was designed specifically to intimidate. His dark eyes swept across the church with the calm focus of a predator assessing its territory. And when those eyes landed on Amaka, they didn't waver. He walked down the aisle with a fluid grace that made people shift in their seats without realizing they were doing it. The sound of his footsteps on the marble floor was the only sound in the entire building. Even the crying had stopped. Amaka couldn't breathe. Her phone was still in her hand, the screen showing that her message had been delivered to a number she now realized, with ice-cold horror, was not her brother's contact. 1 digit off. Just 1. The man reached the altar and climbed the steps with the ease of someone who'd been expected. The priest stumbled backward, his Bible clutched to his chest like a shield, but the man didn't even glance at him. He stopped directly in front of Amaka. Up close, she could see the calluses on his hands when he held one out to her, palm up. Could see the controlled power in the way he held himself, like violence was always an option, but never the first choice. "You texted me," he said, and his voice was low and steady and carried through the church without him having to raise it. "You asked me to take you away." Amaka's breath hitched. I didn't mean to." "I know." Something in his expression softened, just slightly. "But I came anyway." He turned to face the congregation, keeping his hand extended toward her. When he spoke again, his words fell into the silence with the weight of an inevitability that no one could argue with. "I will marry her!" For 3 full seconds, no one breathed. And then Seong-chul came storming back down the aisle, his face red with rage, his hand already reaching for the woman he'd chosen over Amaka. "What the hell is going on? Who do you think you are? The stranger didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on Amaka, kept his hand extended, and said quietly, "Take my hand." She didn't know why she obeyed. Maybe it was shock. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the way he stood there, like an anchor in the middle of her storm. But Amaka placed her trembling hand in his, and his fingers closed around hers with a warmth that felt absurdly gentle given the circumstances. Only then did he turn to look at Seong-chul, and the temperature in the church seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You walked away from her," the man said, in his tone conversational, but laced with something deadly. "You threw a ring at her feet in front of 300 witnesses. You made your choice." He paused, his dark eyes never leaving Seong-chul's increasingly pale face. "Now I'm making mine." Seong-chul's mouth opened and closed, like a fish gasping for air. She's my fiancé. We were supposed to." "You forfeited that right when you humiliated her." The stranger took a single step forward, positioning himself between Amaka and Seong-chul in a way that was unmistakably protective. He didn't touch Seong-chul, didn't threaten him outwardly, but the message was crystal clear. If you value your life, you'll leave. Now. The way he said it, so calm, so certain, made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. Seong-chul's face went from red to white in the span of a heartbeat. Something flickered across his expression that looked a lot like fear. He glanced at Amaka, then at the stranger, then at the men in charcoal suits lining the walls. Then he turned and ran. His groomsmen scrambled after him, nearly tripping over themselves in their haste to escape. The doors slammed shut behind them, and the sound reverberated through the sanctuary like a final punctuation mark on the disaster this day had become. The stranger turned back to Amaka and reached up to gently wipe the tears from her cheeks with his thumb. The gesture was so tender it made her chest ache. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. She shook her head, because how could she be? Her wedding had just imploded. A stranger had just chased her ex-fiancé out of the church. And now that same stranger was asking if she was okay, while standing in the exact spot where Seong-chul had been just minutes before. "Who are you?" she whispered. "My name is Liu Gee," he said, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "And I'm going to marry you if you'll let me." "Why?" The word barely made it past her lips. "Because you deserve better than what just happened to you," Liu Gee said simply. "Because no one should have to stand at this altar alone, and because—" his grip on her hand tightened just slightly. "I can give you a way out of this moment that doesn't end with you being the woman everyone pities." Amaka felt fresh tears slide down her cheeks, but these felt different, less like despair and more like something else she couldn't name. She looked at this stranger who'd kicked down her church doors and offered to save her from her own humiliation, and she made a choice. Maybe it was insane. Maybe it was the worst decision she'd ever make, but it was hers. "Okay," she whispered. Liu Jee's hand tightened around hers, and he turned to the priest. "Proceed." Before we continue, please do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because this story is about to change in ways nobody expects. The priest looked like he was about to pass out. His face had gone the color of old paper, and his hands shook so badly the Bible he was holding rattled audibly in the silence. I don't know if I can do this," he stammered, his voice cracking. "This is highly irregular. I don't even know who you are. There are procedures, licenses, counseling requirements." Liu Gee reached into his jacket pocket with his free hand and pulled out an envelope. He held it out to the priest, who took it with trembling fingers and opened it. Inside was a marriage license, already filled out, already signed. The priest's eyes went wide as saucers as he read it. He looked up at Liu Gee with an expression that was equal parts shock and fear. "How did you—" "Everything you need is there," Liu Gee said, cutting him off smoothly. Everything is legal. Everything is in order. All you have to do is perform the ceremony. The priest looked at Amaka, his eyes searching her face as if looking for some sign that she was being coerced, that she needed help. Amaka could feel her whole body shaking. She could feel the weight of 300 pairs of eyes on her. Her could hear the whispers starting to build like a wave. But she nodded. She didn't know what she was agreeing to. She didn't know what would happen after this. But she knew she couldn't walk out of this church as the woman Seong-chul had abandoned. She wouldn't give him that power over her. The priest swallowed hard and opened his Bible. His voice shook as he began to speak, rushing through the traditional words of the ceremony, like he wanted to get this over with as quickly as possible. Amaka barely heard him. She was too focused on the man standing beside her. On the way, he held her hand like it was something precious. On the way, he stood between her and the rest of the church, like a shield. She could feel the cameras on them, could feel the weight of everyone's shock and judgment. But somehow, with Liu Gee beside her, it felt bearable. "So, do you, Liu Gee, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the priest asked, his voice cracking on the words. "I do," Liu Gee said, and there was no hesitation in his voice. No doubt, just calm certainty. The priest turned to Amaka, and she saw the question in his eyes again, the concern, the uncertainty. "Do you, Amaka, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Amaka looked at Liu Gee. She looked at his face, at the calm strength in his dark eyes, at the way he was standing beside her, like he had every intention of staying there. She thought about Seong-chul, about the way he'd thrown the ring at her and walked away without a second glance. She thought about the cameras and the whispers and the humiliation, and then she thought about the way this stranger had stopped Seong-chul from humiliating her further. The way he'd offered her a way out, the way he was looking at her right now, like she was worth something. "I do," she said, and her voice was stronger than she expected it to be. The priest closed his Bible with a snap that seemed too loud in the quiet church. "Then, by the power vested in me by the state and by God, I now pronounce you husband and wife." He looked at Liu Gee with wide eyes. "You may kiss the bride." Liu Gee turned to face Amaka fully. He released her hand and brought both of his hands up to cup her face with a gentleness that made her want to cry all over again. His thumbs brushed away the tears that were still sliding down her cheeks. And then he leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead. It was a chaste kiss, respectful and tender. And somehow it felt more intimate than anything else could have been in that moment. When he pulled back, he looked down at her with those dark eyes and said quietly, so quietly that only she could hear, "You're safe now. I promise you that." Amaka didn't know why, but she believed him. Liu Gee took her hand again and turned to face the church. The congregation was still sitting in stunned silence, still processing what had just happened. He didn't smile at them. He didn't acknowledge their shock. He simply began to walk down the aisle, and he brought Amaka with him. She walked beside him on bare feet. Her heels had been kicked off somewhere during the chaos, her massive wedding dress rustling around her legs with every step, her hand gripped tightly in his. As they passed the pews, she saw faces she'd known her entire life staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to horror to poorly concealed fascination. She saw her mother reaching out toward her, tears streaming down her face. She saw her father standing rigid and red-faced, looking like he wanted to grab Liu Gee and demand answers. She saw her bridesmaids huddled together, their mouths hanging open, their eyes wide. And she saw the cameras everywhere, phones held high, pointed at her and Liu Gee, recording every moment of this bizarre turn of events. She knew that within hours, maybe even minutes, this would be all over social media. Everyone would see what had happened. Everyone would have an opinion. Everyone would judge her for what she had just done. But as Liu Gee led her toward the doors at the back of the church, how his hand warm and steady around hers, Amaka realized something. She didn't care. Let them talk. Let them judge. Let them post their videos and their hot takes and their commentary. Because for the first time since Seong-chul had thrown that ring at her feet, she didn't feel like she was drowning. She felt like someone had thrown her a lifeline and she'd grabbed it with both hands. They reached the doors, and Liu Gee pushed them open with his free hand. Sunlight poured in, warm and bright, and Amaka had to squint against it. Outside, a sleek black car was waiting at the curb, its engine already running. A man in a dark suit stood beside the open rear door, his hands clasped in front of him, his face expressionless. Liu Gee led Amaka down the steps of the church and across the sidewalk to the car. He helped her inside, his hand on her elbow, guiding her as she gathered up the voluminous skirt of her dress and slid across the leather seat. Then he climbed in after her, and the door closed with a heavy thud that seemed to seal them off from the rest of the world. The car began to move immediately. Amaka turned to look out the back window and saw people spilling out of the church, saw them standing on the steps and pointing at the car as it drove away. She saw her father pushing through the crowd, his mouth open as he shouted something she couldn't hear. She saw cameras flashing, saw phones held high to capture video of the car disappearing down the street. And then the church was behind them, growing smaller and smaller until it was just a white speck in the distance. And then it was gone entirely. Amaka turned back around and pressed her hands to her face. Her whole body was shaking. The adrenaline that had been keeping her upright was starting to drain away, and in its place was a bone-deep exhaustion that made her want to curl up into a ball and never move again. She took several deep breaths, trying to calm herself down, trying to make sense of what had just happened. She had just married a complete stranger. She had just left her entire family and all of her friends standing in a church without any explanation. She had just gotten into a car with a man she didn't know and driven away to a destination she couldn't even begin to guess. "Where are we going?" she asked, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears, high and thin and on the verge of breaking. Liu Gee was sitting beside her, his hands resting on his knees, his posture relaxed despite the insanity of what had just occurred. He looked at her, and his expression was calm and steady, exactly the same as it had been in the church. "Somewhere you can breathe," he said. "Somewhere no one will bother you for a while." Amaka shook her head. The whole thing felt surreal, like she was watching it happen to someone else. "I don't understand any of this. I don't understand why you did what you did. I don't understand who you are or what you want from me." "I don't want anything from you," Liu Gee said, and his tone was matter-of-fact, as if they were discussing the weather instead of the bizarre circumstances of their sudden marriage. "I saw what was happening and I made a choice. That's all." "That's not all," Amaka said, and she could hear the edge of hysteria creeping into her voice. "People don't just walk into churches and marry random strangers. That's not something people do. There has to be a reason. There has to be something you want." Liu Gee was quiet for a moment. He looked out the window at the city passing by, at the buildings and the cars, and the people going about their normal lives, completely unaware of the chaos that had just unfolded. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, and there was something in it that sounded almost like sadness. "I know what it feels like to be humiliated in front of people who are supposed to care about you. I know what it feels like to have everyone watching and no one helping. I didn't want that for you, so I helped." Amaka stared at him. She wanted to argue, wanted to demand more answers, but something about the way he said those words stopped her. There was a weight to them, a history he wasn't sharing, but that she could feel nonetheless. The car turned down a tree-lined street, and Amaka watched as the buildings outside grew taller and more expensive-looking. They were heading into one of the wealthiest parts of the city, the kind of neighborhood where each apartment probably cost more than her parents' entire house. The car pulled into an underground garage beneath a gleaming high-rise, and the driver navigated through rows of luxury vehicles before stopping in front of a private elevator. Liu Gee got out first and came around to help Amaka. She struggled with her dress, the layers of fabric catching on everything, and he ended up simply scooping her into his arms and carrying her out of the car. "I can walk," she protested weakly. "Not in that dress," he said, and there was the faintest hint of amusement in his voice. He carried her to the elevator and set her down gently once they were inside. The doors closed, and Amaka watched as he pressed a button marked PH, Penthouse. Of course! The elevator rose smoothly, and Amaka felt her stomach drop with each passing floor. She caught a glimpse of her reflection in the mirrored walls and barely recognized herself. Her makeup was ruined, mascara tracks down her cheeks. Her hair was falling out of its careful updo. Her dress was wrinkled and dusty from being dragged across the church floor. She looked like a disaster. The elevator doors opened directly into an apartment, and Amaka stepped out into a space that took her breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows lined the entire far wall, offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. The furniture was sleek and modern, all clean lines and expensive materials, and everything was in shades of black, white, and gray, giving the space a sophisticated, masculine feel. It was beautiful. It was also completely intimidating. "Welcome home," Liu Gee said from behind her. Home. The word felt foreign. This wasn't her home. Her home was a small apartment she'd shared with 2 roommates until last month, when she'd moved most of her things into Seong-chul's place in preparation for the wedding. The wedding that had just spectacularly imploded. "Mr. Liu," a voice said, and Amaka turned to see an older woman emerging from what looked like the kitchen. She was Korean, probably in her 60s, with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. "I have prepared the guest room as you requested." "Thank you, Mrs. Kong," Liu Gee said. He gestured to Amaka. "This is Amaka. She'll be staying here. Please make sure she has everything she needs." Mrs. Kong's eyes widened slightly as she took in Amaka's wedding dress, but she recovered quickly and offered a warm smile. "Of course. Welcome, Mrs. Liu." Mrs. Liu. The title hit Amaka like a physical blow. She was married. She was actually married to this stranger, to this man whose last name she now apparently shared. "I'll show you to your room," Mrs. Kong said gently, as if sensing Amaka was on the verge of a breakdown. "You must be exhausted." Amaka followed her down a hallway, her dress trailing behind her like a white shadow. Mrs. Kong opened a door to reveal a spacious bedroom with its own ensuite bathroom. The bed was enormous, covered in soft white linens, and someone had already laid out what looked like comfortable clothes. Silk pajamas in a deep blue. "So the bathroom is fully stocked," Mrs. Kong said. "There are towels, toiletries, everything you might need. If you need anything else, just press the button by the bed and I'll come immediately." "Thank you," Amaka managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Kong hesitated at the door. "Mr. Liu is a good man," she said softly. "I've worked for him for 5 years, and I've never seen him hurt anyone who didn't deserve it. Whatever happened today, whatever brought you here, you're safe now." Then she left, closing the door gently behind her. Amaka stood in the middle of the room for a long moment, just staring at nothing. Then she walked into the bathroom and caught sight of herself in the mirror. She looked like a ghost, a beautiful, tragic ghost in a wedding dress. With shaking hands, she began to undress. The buttons on the back of the dress were impossible to reach on her own, but she managed to get enough of them undone that she could shimmy out of it. The dress pooled on the floor around her feet like melted snow, and she stepped out of it and kicked it aside. She turned on the shower as hot as it would go and stepped under the spray. The water turned gray as it washed away the makeup and the hairspray and the remnants of the worst day of her life. She stood there until the water ran cold, until her fingers pruned and her skin turned pink. Only then did she finally turn off the tap and step out. The silk pajamas fit perfectly, which should have been surprising, but somehow wasn't. Liu Gee seemed like the kind of man who planned for every contingency. Amaka crawled into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin. She expected to lie awake, her mind racing with everything that had happened. But exhaustion pulled her under almost immediately, dragging her down into a dreamless sleep. She woke to the smell of coffee. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then it all came rushing back. The church, Seoul, Liu Gee, the car, the penthouse. She sat up slowly, her body aching like she'd run a marathon. Sunlight was streaming through the windows. She'd slept through the entire afternoon and night. There was a soft knock on the door. "Come in," Amaka called. Mrs. Kong entered with a tray. "Good morning. I brought you some breakfast. Mr. Liu asked me to let you know he'd like to speak with you when you're ready." The breakfast was simple but perfect. Fresh fruit, toast, eggs, and that coffee she'd smelled. Amaka ate mechanically, tasting nothing, and then dressed in the clothes that had been laid out for her. Jeans and a soft cashmere sweater that probably cost more than her entire wardrobe back home. She found Liu Gee in the living room, standing by the windows with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the city. He'd changed out of his suit into dark slacks and a white button-down with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. It was the most casual she'd seen him, and somehow it made him seem more human. He turned when he heard her approach. "How are you feeling?" "Like I'm living in a fever dream," Amaka said honestly. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Understandable." He gestured to the couch. "Sit, we should talk." Amaka sat, tucking her legs under her. Liu Gee took the chair across from her, leaning back with that same controlled ease he always seemed to carry. "You deserve to know who you married," he said without preamble. "You deserve to know what you've walked into." Amaka's heart started to pound. "Okay." Liu Gee was quiet for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "I'm what people might call a businessman, but my business isn't exactly conventional." "What does that mean?" "It means I operate in the spaces between legal and illegal. I own legitimate businesses, restaurants, real estate, import-export companies. But I also control other things: territory, information, influence." He met her eyes steadily. "Some people would call me a crime boss, a mafia boss, if you want to use that word." The confession should have terrified her, should have sent her running for the door. But Amaka had seen enough yesterday to know that Liu Gee wasn't the kind of man who needed to lie. If he wanted to hurt her, he could have done it already. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you need to understand what staying here means," Liu Gee said. "If you stay, you'll be associated with me, protected by me, yes, but also a target for anyone who wants to get to me. Your life will change in ways you can't imagine. And if I don't stay, then I'll have my driver take you wherever you want to go. I'll make sure you're financially secure. Enough money to start over somewhere new, if that's what you want. The marriage can be annulled quietly. No one will bother you." It was a generous offer, more than generous. He was giving her a way out with no strings attached. Amaka looked at him, really looked at him, at the way he sat there, waiting for her answer with that same calm patience, at the way he'd positioned himself across from her instead of next to her, giving her space, at the way he'd kept every promise he'd made so far. She thought about what waited for her outside this penthouse, her family, who would demand explanations she didn't have, her friends, who had watched her marry a stranger, the social media posts, the gossip, the endless questions and judgment, and Seoul, somewhere out there with the woman he'd chosen over her. She thought about how small she'd felt standing at that altar, how humiliated, how broken. And then she thought about how Liu Gee had made her feel when he'd taken her hand. Safe, protected, like she was worth saving. What would staying look like? She asked quietly. Liu Gee considered this. You would live here. You would have everything you need, anything you want. In public. We would present as a married couple. In private. He paused. In private, we would negotiate boundaries as we go. I won't force anything on you. You'll have your own space, your own life. But you would be under my protection, which means following certain rules for your safety. What kind of rules? You don't go anywhere without security. You don't share details about me or my business with anyone. You trust me when I tell you something is dangerous. He leaned forward slightly. I know it sounds controlling, but in my world, these rules keep people alive. Amaka absorbed this. It was a lot. It was overwhelming, but it was also clear, honest. He wasn't trying to manipulate her or paint a prettier picture than reality. Can I ask you something? She said. Anything. The marriage license. You had it ready. How you had it prepared before you even got to the church. She met his eyes. How? Liu Gee didn't look away. My organization had been monitoring Seoul for weeks. He was involved with some people I have an interest in. When I got your text, I looked into who you were, and I made a decision in the car on the way to the church. What decision? That if you agreed, I would marry you. That I would make you my wife, protect you, and in doing so, gain a legitimate public image that I need for certain business dealings. He said it so matter-of-factly, so honestly, that it almost didn't sound as calculating as it was. I won't lie to you, Amaka. Marrying you serves my purposes. But that doesn't mean I don't intend to honor the vows I made. She should be angry. She should be furious that he'd orchestrated this. That he'd used her humiliation for his own gain. But the strange thing was, she wasn't. Because he'd saved her. Whatever his motives, whatever he got out of it, he'd saved her from the worst moment of her life and given her a choice about what came next. And he was still giving her that choice now. If I stay, Amaka said slowly, I want to be clear about something. What's that? I'm not going to be some trophy wife who just looks pretty and keeps her mouth shut. If I'm going to be part of this, I want to actually be part of it. I want to understand your world. I want to make my own decisions, and I want to be treated like an equal. Something flickered in Liu Gee's eyes. Respect, maybe, or approval. I wouldn't expect anything less. You have a fire in you, Amaka. I saw it yesterday when you agreed to marry me. I have no interest in extinguishing that fire. Amaka took a deep breath. This was insane. This was absolutely insane. 24 hours ago, she'd been preparing to marry Seoul. Now she was sitting in a penthouse, married to a crime boss, negotiating the terms of a life she couldn't have imagined in her wildest dreams. But as she looked at Liu Gee, at the man who'd kicked down her church doors and offered her a way out of her humiliation, she realized something. She didn't want to go back. She didn't want to face the pity and the judgment and the endless questions. She didn't want to rebuild her life from the rubble Seoul had left behind. She wanted to start over. She wanted to be someone new, someone stronger, someone who didn't let the world break her. And maybe, just maybe, she could be that person here. Okay, she said, her voice steady. I'll stay. Liu Gee nodded slowly, and for the first time since she'd met him, he smiled. It was a small smile, barely there, but it transformed his face, made him look less like a dangerous stranger and more like a man who'd just been given something he hadn't realized he wanted. Then welcome home, Mrs. Liu, he said. And despite everything, despite the insanity of it all, Amaka found herself smiling back. The first week passed in a strange blur of normalcy and surrealism. Amaka learned the rhythms of the penthouse, learned that Mrs. Kong made the best Korean breakfast she'd ever tasted, learned that Liu Gee left early every morning and sometimes didn't return until well after midnight. She learned that the two bodyguards who appeared whenever she left the building were named Minho and Dai Jung. and that they were surprisingly good conversationalists, despite their intimidating appearance. She also learned that the internet had exploded. Mrs. Kong tried to keep the tablet away from her, but Amaka insisted on seeing. The videos were everywhere. Shaky phone footage of Seong Chul's betrayal, of Liu Gee's dramatic entrance, of the entire bizarre wedding ceremony. The comments ranged from supportive to vicious, and Amaka forced herself to read them all until Liu Gee came home and physically took the tablet out of her hands. "Stop torturing yourself," he said. "I need to know what people are saying." "Why? Their opinions don't matter." "They matter to me," Amaka said, and hated how small her voice sounded. Liu Gee studied her for a long moment, then sat down beside her on the couch. "The noise will die down. It always does. Something else will happen. Someone else will become the story, and this will fade into nothing more than an interesting anecdote." "Easy for you to say. You're not the one they're calling desperate and pathetic." "No. They're calling me a psychopath who kidnapped a bride." He said it so casually that Amaka almost laughed. We all have our crosses to bear. But the noise didn't die down. If anything, it got worse. 3 weeks after the wedding, Amaka woke to find her phone blowing up with notifications. She opened social media to find her face plastered across every gossip site and news outlet. The headlines were brutal. "Wedding crasher's wife. The truth about Amaka's past. From altar to arms dealer, inside the scandal." She knew who he was. Sources say marriage was planned. The articles were filled with lies and half-truths, in painting her as a gold digger who'd orchestrated the entire thing, who'd known exactly who Liu Gee was, and had used Seong Chul's betrayal as an opportunity to trap a richer man. There were quotes from anonymous sources close to the situation, claiming she'd been in contact with Liu Gee for months, that the whole thing had been a setup. Amaka's hands shook as she scrolled through article after article. Her phone rang. Her mother. She declined the call. It rang again, a number she didn't recognize. Then another, and another. She turned off her phone and sat in the silence of her room, feeling the walls close in around her. There was a knock on her door. "Amaka!" Mrs. Kong's voice. "Mr. Liu would like to see you." Amaka found him in his office, a room she'd only glimpsed in passing before. He was behind a massive desk, his laptop open in front of him, but his attention was focused on her the moment she walked in. "I've seen the articles," he said without preamble. "Then you know everyone thinks I'm a scheming—" "I know what your rival is trying to do," Liu Gee interrupted. His voice was calm, but there was steel underneath it. "The sources in those articles, they all trace back to her. She's been feeding stories to journalists for the past week." Amaka blinked. "How do you know that?" "Because I make it my business to know these things." He closed his laptop and stood. "I'm going to handle this. By tonight, those articles will be gone, and no reputable outlet will touch another story about you without facing consequences." "You can't just make news articles disappear." Liu Gee's expression was almost amused. "Can't I?" He made a single phone call. Amaka only heard his side of the conversation, delivered in rapid Korean, his tone leaving no room for argument. When he hung up, he looked at her. "It's done." "What's done?" "The outlets will issue retractions. The articles will be taken down. And your rival will find that her own past is suddenly very interesting to investigative journalists." Amaka felt a chill run down her spine. "What does that mean?" "It means she should have thought twice before trying to destroy you." Liu Gee came around the desk to stand in front of her. "I told you when you agreed to stay here that you would be under my protection. That includes protecting your reputation, your dignity, and your peace of mind. By destroying hers? By making sure she understands that there are consequences for her actions." His dark eyes held hers. "I won't apologize for protecting what's mine, Amaka." "What's mine?" The possessiveness in those words should have bothered her. Instead, it sent a strange warmth through her chest. By that evening, the articles were gone. In their place were retractions, apologies, and, just as Liu Gee had promised, a series of exposés about Seong-chul's new girlfriend, detailing her family's tax evasion and her own history of bullying in university. Amaka should have felt guilty. She didn't. She felt protected. The second incident came a month later. Amaka was in the penthouse living room, reading, when Mrs. Kong informed her that someone was at the front desk asking to see her. "Who?" Amaka asked. Mrs. Kong's expression was carefully neutral. "Seong-chul, ma'am." Amaka's stomach dropped. She hadn't seen or heard from him since the wedding. Just part of her had hoped she never would again. "Tell him I'm not here." "Mr. Liu suggested you might want to speak with him," Mrs. Kong said carefully. "He's on his way back now. He said to have Mr. Seong wait in the lobby if you're willing." Amaka wanted to say no, wanted to hide in her room like a coward. But she'd promised herself when she decided to stay that she wouldn't be that person anymore. Wouldn't be the woman who shrank away from difficult things. "Tell him I'll be down in 10 minutes. She changed out of her comfortable clothes into something more armor-like, a sleek black dress that Liu Gee had bought her, paired with heels that made her almost as tall as Seong-chul. She fixed her hair, applied lipstick like war paint, and took the elevator down to the lobby with Minho as her shadow. Seong-chul was standing by the windows, while looking out at the street. He turned when he heard her approach, and Amaka had the satisfaction of seeing his eyes widen. She looked different than she had at the wedding. Her hair was different, cut shorter, styled with confidence. Her clothes were expensive, well-tailored. She carried herself differently, stood taller. She looked like she belonged in a penthouse lobby, like she belonged in this life. She looked like someone who hadn't spent the last month crying over him. "Amaka," Seong-chul said, and his voice was softer than she remembered. Gentler. "You look good. What do you want, Seong-chul?" He flinched at the coldness in her tone. "I wanted to talk to you, to apologize, to explain." "There's nothing to explain. You made your choice very publicly." "I made a mistake." He took a step toward her, and Minho immediately moved to block him. Seong-chul stopped, his eyes flicking nervously to the bodyguard before returning to Amaka. "I was confused. I thought I wanted her, but I was wrong. I want you. I've always wanted you." Amaka stared at him. 6 weeks ago, these words would have meant everything to her. 6 weeks ago, she would have fallen into his arms, would have forgiven him anything just to have him back. Now, they just made her tired. "No, you don't," she said quietly. "You want what you can't have. You want to win. But I'm not a prize, Seong-chul. I'm not something you can discard and then reclaim when it's convenient." "That's not what I'm doing." "That's exactly what you're doing." Amaka crossed her arms. "You humiliated me in front of everyone I know. You threw a ring at my feet like I was garbage. And now you expect me to just forget that because you've had a change of heart?" "I know I hurt you," Seong-chul said, and there was desperation creeping into his voice now. "But this—" He gestured around the lobby at the luxury surrounding them. "This isn't you. This isn't the life you want. That man you married, he's dangerous. He's a criminal. You need to get away from him before it's too late." "Is that what you tell yourself?" a new voice said, and Amaka turned to see Liu Gee stepping out of the elevator. He'd come directly from wherever he'd been, still in his suit, his expression calm, but his eyes cold. "That you're here to save her?" Seong-chul's face went pale. "I'm here to talk to Amaka. This is between us." "Nothing involving my wife is between you and anyone else," Liu Gee said, and the quiet menace in his voice made the temperature in the lobby drop 10 degrees. He came to stand beside Amaka, not touching her, but close enough that his presence felt like a shield. "You had your chance with her. You threw it away in the most spectacular fashion possible. You don't get another one." "She deserves to know what kind of man you are," Seong-chul said, trying for bravery and failing. She deserves to know about your business, about the things you've done. She knows exactly who I am. Liu Gee interrupted. I've never lied to her, never hidden what I do from her. Can you say the same? Or were you planning to tell her about the gambling debts? About the woman in Seoul you were seeing for 6 months before the wedding? Amaka's head snapped toward Seongchul. What? Seongchul's face had gone from pale to red. That's not. I don't know what he's talking about. Her name is Minji, Liu Gee continued, his tone conversational. You met her at a business conference last year. You've been supporting her apartment in Gangnam. Should I continue, or would you like to leave with some dignity intact? Seongchul looked between them, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. Finally, he looked at Amaka. You're really going to choose him over me? Over everything we had? We didn't have anything, Amaka said, and she was surprised by how calm her voice was. We had a relationship built on my willingness to ignore red flags, and your willingness to lie. I'm not choosing him over you, I'm choosing myself over you. And that includes choosing a man who's honest about his flaws over one who pretends to have none. She turned to Liu Gee. Can we go? Of course. He offered her his arm, which she took, and they walked toward the elevator together. Just before the doors closed, Liu Gee turned back to look at Seongchul one last time. If you come near her again, he said, his voice soft and deadly, I will make you regret it in ways you cannot imagine. And unlike you, I keep my promises. The doors slid shut. In the elevator, Amaka's hands were shaking. The adrenaline that had kept her upright was starting to fade, leaving her feeling hollowed out and exhausted. Did you mean it? Liu Gee asked quietly. Mean what? What you said, about choosing honesty over pretense. Amaka looked at him. At this man who'd been a stranger 2 months ago and was now her husband, who'd protected her, sheltered her, given her space to heal and grow. Yes, she said. I meant it. Something in his expression softened. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture so gentle it made her breath catch. Good, he said. The attack came on a Tuesday. Amaka had started venturing out more, going to lunch with a few friends who'd reached out after the initial scandal died down, visiting galleries and shops with Minho and Dae-jung as her constant shadows. She was learning to live with the protection, learning to appreciate it rather than resent it. She was in the car, returning from lunch, when it happened. The black SUV came out of nowhere, slamming into the side of their vehicle with a force that sent them spinning. Amaka screamed as the world tilted, as glass shattered and metal crunched. The car finally stopped, resting at an angle that left her suspended in her seatbelt, disoriented and terrified. Mrs. Liu! Minho was already out of the front seat, wrenching her door open. We need to move, now! What's happening? Now! He repeated, and the urgency in his voice cut through her shock. He pulled her from the car, and Amaka stumbled on shaking legs. Dae-jung was beside them, gun drawn, his eyes scanning the street. There were people everywhere, other cars, bystanders with phones out recording everything. And there were men. 3 of them, approaching from different directions, their hands reaching into their jackets. Minho pushed Amaka behind him, just as the first shot rang out. The world exploded into chaos. Dae-jung returned fire, and people started screaming and running. Minho was dragging Amaka behind a parked car, his body covering hers, and she could hear more gunshots. Jees could smell gunpowder and fear. Stay down, Minho ordered, and then he was moving, coordinating with Dae-jung in rapid Korean. It lasted less than 2 minutes, but it felt like hours. When the shooting finally stopped, 2 of the attackers were on the ground, and the third was running. Police sirens wailed in the distance. Amaka was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Minho pulled her to her feet, and she saw blood on his arm. You're hurt! It's nothing. We need to get you somewhere safe. Another car appeared, this one with more of Liu Gee's men. They were bundled inside and driven away before the police could arrive, before anyone could ask questions. They took her to a different building, a safe house that Liu Gee apparently kept for situations like this. Amaka was checked over by a doctor, who assured her she was fine. Gee just bruised and shaken. Then she was left alone in a secure room to wait. Liu Gee arrived an hour later. He came through the door like a storm, his face carved from stone, his eyes blazing with a fury she'd never seen before. He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "Are you hurt?" His hands moved over her, checking for injuries, his touch almost frantic. "I'm fine. Liu Gee, I'm fine." "They shot at you." His voice was raw. "They could have killed you." "But they didn't. Your men protected me, Minho and Daejung." I know what they did." He pulled back enough to look at her, his hands framing her face. "This is my fault. I should have seen this coming. Should have had more security." "This isn't your fault," Amaka interrupted. "You warned me this could happen. I chose to stay anyway." "You shouldn't have to live like this. You shouldn't have to be afraid." "I'm not afraid," Amaka said, and realized it was true. She was shaken, yes. Traumatized by what had just happened. But she wasn't afraid. Because Liu Gee had kept his promise. His people had protected her, had put their own lives on the line to keep her safe. And now Liu Gee was here, holding her like she was something precious, something worth protecting at any cost. "I'm not afraid," she repeated, softer this time, "because I trust you." Liu Gee closed his eyes for a moment, his forehead resting against hers. When he opened them again, the fury was still there, but it was controlled now, focused. "The people who did this will regret it," he said quietly. "I will make sure of that. What are you going to do? Whatever needs to be done to ensure this never happens again." He didn't elaborate, and Amaka didn't ask. She was learning that there were parts of Liu Gee's world that she didn't need to see, didn't need to know about. She trusted him to handle them. That night, he didn't leave her. He stayed in the safe house, sleeping in a chair beside her bed, and every time she woke from nightmares of gunshots and screeching tires, he was there. 2 weeks later, Liu Gee asked her to accompany him to a dinner. "It's a business meeting," he explained. "Important people. They've been asking to meet you, to see the woman who married me." Amaka's stomach twisted with nerves. "What kind of important people?" "The kind who exist in the same world I do. So the kind who will judge whether you're a liability or an asset. And if they decide I'm a liability, then I'll have to convince them otherwise." He smiled, but there was no humor in it. Preferably without violence. The dinner was at an exclusive restaurant that had been closed to the public for the evening. Amaka wore a dress that Mrs. Kong had helped her choose, elegant and understated in deep emerald that brought out her skin tone. Liu Gee wore a suit that probably cost more than a car, and when he offered her his arm, she took it with only a slight tremor in her hands. There were 6 other people at the dinner, 3 couples, all of them older than Liu Gee and Amaka. The men had the same air of controlled power that Liu Gee carried, and their wives watched Amaka with calculating eyes. "So this is the famous bride," one of the men said in accented English, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "The woman who turned Liu Gee's life upside down." "I prefer to think of it as giving it a new direction," Amaka replied, keeping her voice steady. The man laughed. "She has spirit. I like that." The dinner was a test, Amaka realized. Every question, every comment, every look was designed to gauge her worth, to see if she would crack under pressure or rise to the occasion. She chose to rise. When one of the wives asked about her background, she answered honestly about her education, her work, her life before the wedding. When one of the men asked how she was adjusting to her new life, she smiled and said she was learning to appreciate the unique opportunities it presented. Sias, and when the conversation turned to business, to territories and shipments, and things that should have made her uncomfortable, she didn't flinch. She listened. She asked intelligent questions when appropriate, and she showed them that she wasn't some naive girl who'd stumbled into this world by accident. She was Liu Gee's wife, and she intended to act like it. At one point, the conversation turned to the recent attack. One of the men looked at Amaka with something like sympathy. "That must have been terrifying," he said. "It was," Amaka admitted, "but it also made me realize something." "What's that?" "That I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." She looked at Liu Gee, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "With exactly who I'm supposed to be with." The table went quiet. Then one of the wives began to clap, slowly, and the others joined in. "Well said, my dear," she said in Korean accented English. "Welcome to the family." In the car on the way home, Liu Gee took her hand. "You were magnificent," he said quietly. "I was terrified." "I know, but you didn't let them see it. You held your ground, showed them your strength." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "You showed them why I married you." "I thought you married me for your public image." "That's what I told myself at the time." His dark eyes met hers in the dim light of the car. "But the truth is, I married you because the moment I read that text, the moment I saw you standing at that altar with tears on your face and fire in your eyes, I knew you were someone extraordinary, someone worth keeping." Amaka's breath caught in her throat. Liu Gee." "I'm not good with words," he interrupted. "I'm not good at expressing feelings. But you should know that what started as a business decision has become something more. You've become something more." He didn't say the words, didn't say, "I love you," but Amaka could hear them in the careful way he spoke, in the way he looked at her like she was a puzzle he was determined to solve. And she realized that somewhere along the way, between the protection and the honesty and the quiet moments in the penthouse, she'd started to feel the same way. A year passed. Amaka stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, looking out at the city lights. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of the party Liu Gee had insisted on throwing, their one-year anniversary celebration, attended by all the people who'd become part of her new world. She barely recognized the woman she'd been a year ago. That woman had been broken, humiliated, lost. This woman, the one reflected in the glass, was strong, confident. She'd learned to navigate Liu Gee's world with grace, had proven herself to be more than just his wife. She handled negotiations, managed relationships with other families, had even saved a deal from falling through when Liu Gee was out of the country. She'd become the queen he'd promised she could be. "There you are!" Liu Gee's voice came from behind her, and she turned to find him approaching with 2 glasses of champagne. He handed her one. "Hiding from your own party?" "Just taking a moment." He came to stand beside her, looking out at the same view. "Regrets?" "About what?" "About saying yes. About staying. About all of this." Amaka looked at him, at the man who'd crashed her wedding and changed her life, at the husband who'd kept every promise he'd made, at the partner who'd shown her that protection and freedom weren't mutually exclusive. "Not a single one," she said honestly. Liu Gee reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "Good, because I have something for you." Amaka opened the box to find a ring. Not the simple band from the wedding. This was different. An emerald surrounded by diamonds, elegant and stunning and clearly chosen with care. "The ring from the wedding was practical," Liu Gee said quietly. "Something that could be produced quickly, that would serve its purpose. But you deserve more than practical. You deserve something real." He took the ring from the box and slipped it onto her finger beside the wedding band. You deserve to know that what we have is real. Amaka looked up at him, this man who'd never been good with words, who showed his feelings through actions rather than declarations. I love you, she said, speaking the words he'd never quite managed to say himself. Liu Gee's expression transformed. He set down his champagne glass and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that had been building between them for months. When he finally pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers and said the words she'd been waiting to hear. I love you too, he whispered. My queen, my wife, my everything. From somewhere in the apartment, Amaka could hear Mrs. Kong calling them back to the party, could hear the laughter and music and celebration of a life she'd built from the ashes of her humiliation. She'd been saved from a nightmare and given a dream she'd never known she wanted. And as Liu Gee took her hand and led her back to their guests, Amaka realized that the woman everyone had pitied a year ago had become someone they now envied. She'd become someone she was proud to be. She'd become Liu Gee's wife in every sense of the word, and in doing so, she'd found herself.